Go.
Hi. Today we would like to show you the research we did on two very unique individuals. One thing that they had in common was changing through a pivotal moment. We divided our research to present to you the before and after of Nelson Mandela and Samantha Litwiate. While we present our information, we would like for you to think about what we have discussed in class about forgiveness and form an opinion of whether or not these individuals can be forgiven.
My name is Katie Schimpf, and I will be discussing more of the early days of Nelson Mandela. Some background: according to the African American Encyclopedia, Nelson Mandela was born in 1918. And a very interesting fact that I found about Nelson Mandela was that his original name was actually Roli Halahala, and it's translated to troublemaker. So when going through this and figuring out this information, I wondered if this could maybe be foreshadowing his future to come. But along with that, he was renamed Nelson by one of his African American teachers by the age of 7. Fast forwarding a little bit to his college years, which was more of the transitional years for Nelson Mandela, he met Walter Sisulu and some other leaders within the African National Congress, otherwise known as ANC, and he decided to join the ANC in 1944. He organized the ANC's Youth League, and he led non-violent protests, boycotts, and strikes against the apartheid laws. Now, I really want you to pay attention to the fact that I said non-violent. Now, a refresher of what the apartheid was, as we kind of briefly mentioned within class, and we watched the document in the beginning of the school year about it. The apartheid was the racial separation of the South Africans. And when looking up some more about this apartheid, I wanted to see what laws that he strictly boycotted and led strikes against. And some of the laws that I found to be very interesting, I'm going to read to you. And according to the Apartheid Laws Timeline, Act number 30 was the Population Registration Act. This required every South African to be racially classified. When looking into this, I also found that they had to carry around a pass that actually had their racial identity on them. The next was the Act number 44, Suppression of Communism Act, which was basically the apartheid law that Nelson Mandela was all about. This outlawed communism and the Community Party in South Africa. However, I found this very interesting that the South African's government definition of communism was anything that called for a radical change within the government. So if you led a strike, if you led a protest, if you honestly just spoke your opinion, you were considered a communist. By him being wrapped up within the Suppression of the Communism Act, he decided to open up his first law firm. And shortly after, he was arrested, for they felt as if he was a threat because they were scared that he was going to initiate laws that would go against the government, therefore arresting him under the Suppression of Communism. He was banned from organizational meetings, which meant he was not allowed to meet with the ANC, and he was restricted to only stay within Johannesburg. However, by being banned, they decided to move all of their organizational meetings underground. A lot of their meetings took place in Durban. But however, the most pivotal moment as to when these meetings took place was in accordance to the Sharpeville Massacre. The Sharpeville Massacre occurred in 1960, and a little brief information about it was basically the Sharpeville residents all crowded a police department, and they demanded that they should be arrested for they did not have their racial identity cards with them. And the police were very shooken up by how many residents there were, because the crowd went from about 5,000 to 20,000 by midday. I found all this information in an article by Gary Baines in an article titled Remembering Sharpeville. And by the panic of the police, they decided to fire on these non-violent residents of Sharpeville. The result of it all was that they killed about 69 residents and 186 were wounded. As described within this article, it said that this was the main pivotal moment for Nelson Mandela and for the African National Congress, for this strictly stated that their non-violent method was not working, for the police fired against non-violent citizens. So when they organized their meetings underground, in 1961, the ANC established the Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is translated as Sphere of the Nation. They were also referred to as MK, and they were a group for sabotage. In an article titled MK and the Armed Struggle, they stated what the MK's aim was. And their aim was to hit back by all means within our power in defense of our people, our future, and our freedom. I found a very interesting quote by Mandela through the whole transition of the ANC. And it said that if the government reaction is to crush by naked force our nonviolent struggle, we will have to reconsider our tactics. In my mind, we are closing a chapter on this question of a nonviolent policy. So in other words, Nelson Mandela was ready to take action because this nonviolent policy was not working anymore. Many people within the Congress and other apartheid organizations, anti-apartheid organizations, were not necessarily on board with him at first. However, a man by the name of M.D. Naidu, he is a member of the South African Congress, made a comment that they were all afraid just to go to jail. And through that comment, by the next day, everyone agreed that Nelson Mandela were to take authority, and from there, the Umkhonto we Sizwe took charge. They planned 134 acts of sabotage. However, it was very strictly to minor damage. It was a lot of bombings of government buildings and taking action on government installations. However, when looking at this information, I wondered who all exactly viewed him as a communist, and I broke it up between the two very important figures of the South African government, and I wanted to see how Nelson Mandela viewed himself. The South African government viewed him as a communist because everything he did were to go against the government. And as I also explained within the apartheid laws, every protest, every type of speaking up against the government is considered a communist. However, when reading an article about Nelson Mandela, he viewed himself as a leader, and he viewed himself as bringing about change for equality. Not just equality for the people, but equality for South Africa. Once returning to South Africa, he was convinced of conspiracy to overthrow the government, and he was sentenced to life in prison. A very big question that rose to me was, why was he only sentenced to life in prison and not sentenced to death? However, it found out that through the rest of his actions, the government felt as if he was moving for a cause because of the fact that they fight against nonviolent citizens. They felt as if strictly just sending him to prison was what he was needing.
And that's where I'll start off. I'm Jessica Brubaker, and I will be talking about actor Nelson Mandela's pivotal moment. And my research actually started with his trial before he was sentenced to a life term in prison. His famous speech, "An Ideal for Which I Am Prepared to Die," that he gave on trial is very long, and I found a quote that I really liked from it that I will share with you. "Some of the things so far told to the court are true, and some are untrue. I do not, however, deny that I planned sabotage. I did not plan it in a spirit of recklessness, nor because I have any love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation, and opposition of my people by the whites." And so in that, he admitted to helping form the terrorist group that Katie was talking about called Spear the Nation, and he ended up going to prison in June of 1964. He spent 27 years there. 18 of those years were spent at Robben Island, which is a infamous, very strict place. For example, he was only allowed one visitor a year, and that visitation was only allowed to be 30 minutes. And it was hard labor, constantly no plumbing in the cells. And actually, it was funny, while in jail, he organized a protest and got all the rest of the prisoners involved in it, trying to get better conditions for them. So even though he was sentenced to life in prison, he was still fighting for the equality that he had been fighting for out of prison. And so in 1989 is when the apartheid laws started to unravel, because the president of South Africa was W.D. de Klerk, or F.W. de Klerk, I'm sorry. And in 1989 is when the president ordered Nelson Mandela's release from prison. In a speech that he gave just hours after his release was quoted, "Today, the majority of South Africans, black and white, recognize that the apartheid has no future. It has to be ended by our decisive mass action. We have waited too long for our freedom." So this is showing that he, even through all the entire life sentence in prison, he is still fighting for what he's been fighting for his entire life of equality and racial equality. And so after his release in 1991, he became the president of the African National Congress. And then in 1993, him and F.W. de Klerk, who was the president of South Africa, received a joint Nobel Peace Prize for all of their work with the apartheid. And then in 1994, he became the first black South African president. And he served that term until 1999. And then recently in 2005, he decided to retire from retirement, sort of, where he became more hidden away, and his recent death was just in December of 2013, and in that time, from being South Africa's president to his death, he was known as a very political figure in the entire world. He went on Oprah, he visited with presidents of all kinds of nations trying to get the word out of equality and show and tell his story of what he's done and how he can help everyone else.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Rector, and I'm going to talk to you about the early years of Samantha Lithwaite. In a United Kingdom news article, it stated that she was born May 2nd, 1983 in Northern Ireland. This was a time known as the Troubles. And the Troubles was a 30-year war that was going on over an issue in deciding the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. The Unionist and Protestant majority wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom, but the nationalist Catholic minority wished to become part of the Republic of Ireland. Her dad was a British officer and her mother was an Irish Catholic, and at the time this was the equivalent of being star-crossed lovers because her dad was on one end of the issue and her mother was on the other. This part of the country was scarred by violence, and that was still going on when she was born, so she was kind of born into a violent time. Her first crush was supposedly on a Muslim boy at age 11, and this could possibly be a foreshadowing of what was to come later in her lifetime. Her parents' split caused her to confide in a local Muslim family, and this led to her conversion to Muslim after she turned 15, and she also changed her name when she converted. Her religious interest grew when she enrolled with intentions of studying religions and politics at London School of Oriental and African Studies. However, she left the school after being there for 2 months. She married a man named Jermaine Lindsay, who became a suicide bomber that bombed a subway known as the 7/7 attack. And I found a couple of quotes from people that knew her as a child in a Fox News article that kind of give insights and foreshadowing to what's to come later in her life that Kelly's going to talk to you about. Many knew her as a child disbelieved that she would ever be involved in something like this attack. However, a neighbor, Ray Davis, commented after the attack, "She walked around like she was on top of the world. I hope they catch her, and I hope they kill her." A school counselor said, "I knew her as a child. She was innocent and lacking confidence, shy and easy to get along with. She was a follower, not a leader." Another neighbor stated, "Her father has been dignified. He served his country. His daughter is apparently tarnishing both his and his country's reputation." And this could be a foreshadowing of her acting out against her parents' divorce. A terrorism specialist doubted her involvement in the 7/7 attack because her knowledge of the attack could have potentially compromised the attack. He also stated that it is fairly common for converters to overcompensate by becoming more radical than the ones around them. They want to prove themselves, and it is also common that they raise their children in their father's footsteps. All of these quotes can be linked to her later life and other events that followed the 7/7 attack.
Hi, my name is Kelly McMahon, and I'm going to be talking to you about the later days of Samantha Lithwaite. Samantha Lithwaite is the widow of Jermaine Lindsay, who is believed to be part of the Al-Shabaab terrorist group, which stands for Party of the Youth. Lithwaite's husband was a 7/7 suicide bomber. This was a series of coordinated suicide attacks in 2005. They targeted civilians that were using the transportation systems in London. Hundreds of people were wounded, while 74 were found dead. After the bombings, Lithwaite condemned her husband's actions, and she stated that someone must have poisoned his mind. Later, in October of 2013, police found a hard drive left in a house in the Kenyan city. According to the Global Post, authorities seized the computer, which contained a poem to Osama bin Laden, along with web searches on how to make a bomb. The poem was 34 lines, mourning Osama's death. "O Sheikh Osama, my father, my brother, my love for you is like no other," she wrote. "Us, we are left to continue what you started." Also, along with the poem, police found multiple diary entries where she described her children as wanting to be holy warriors when they grew up. Now that we've seen the journeys of these two individuals, one whose lives have been studied from beginning to end, and another's whose life is still ongoing. Throughout this study, we as a group based our research on the question of forgiveness and how we feel these individuals should or should not be forgiven.
And when going off of that concept, we decided remotely as a whole that we feel as if Nelson Mandela rightfully had the right to be forgiven as he was. For he had a straight passion and he never gave up on that passion, and the passion was for equality, and it was for the better reasoning for the country. And it was just the government's own fault for being blind and not seeing that and having their own apartheid and whatnot, their laws. However, when it comes to Samantha Lithwaite, we kind of not exactly differ, but because her journey is still ongoing and there's so much information that kind of she can be linked to, or she can kind of be not directly linked to the case and whatnot. I kind of looked at it in a psychology reasoning because I'm a psych major, and I feel as if maybe from her parents' divorce, it could have maybe put her into a mental state of mind to where she could honestly not really be recognizing what all she's doing, because she might be really over-influenced by everything around her. And I mean, I don't feel at this point she should be forgiven, but I mean, you never know what the future has for her.
And my viewpoint of Samantha Lithwaite is that we can't really decide whether she should be forgiven yet because we know so little about her. Like Rebecca and Kelly were saying that she's been linked with something, she's been associated with things, and they have found her diaries and such, but there's no definitive evidence that she's done all this, so the question of forgiveness is kind of at a standstill right now for me.
I think the same thing as Jessica on this one pretty much. Considering there's no proof that she has actually been involved with these things makes it kind of hard because we don't know if there's actually anything to forgive her for. We do know about her diaries and her poem, which kind of suggests that she wanted these things to happen and wishes that they would still happen. So we'll have to just see where it goes because she's still very young.
My viewpoint as of now is that Samantha should not be forgiven because if she is linked with all these bombings and attacks, she's harming innocent people that have nothing to do with anything. But like they said, her journey is still ongoing and it may change in the future.
Thank you.
And that's the end of our presentation.